"When is the wedding, David?" I asked, my voice soft with anticipation, the phone warm against my cheek as I leaned on the counter of my quiet kitchen. For a heartbeat, I thought I heard hesitation. Then another voice cut through Melissa's. She wasn't on the phone yet. She was in my living room, perched confidently on the sofa I had bought for them 3 summers ago. She turned her head slowly, her lips curling into a cold, deliberate smile. "Oh, you missed it yesterday," she said. "Only special people were invited." The words pierced me sharper than any knife. My chest constricted as though 1,000 pounds had been dropped on me. I froze where I stood, the phone still pressed to my ear, though there was no need for it anymore. My son sat beside her, eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet mine, and in that instant I knew I was not special, not to him, not to them. I felt the blood drain from my face. For 3 years I had paid their rent, $600 every month without fail. I had stocked their refrigerator when Melissa cried that they had nothing to eat. I had bought the sofa Melissa was now lounging on, the dining set they bragged about to guests, even the curtains she'd chosen, but never paid for. Every piece of their comfort had my fingerprints on it. And yet, when it came to the one moment in life I had dreamed of for decades, my son's wedding, I was discarded like an afterthought. The dress I'd purchased still hung in my closet, a shimmering sea green gown I had chosen with care. The matching shoes sat in their box, waiting for a dance that would never come. I had spent $200 on that outfit, planning how I would look standing proudly in photographs beside my only child. Photographs I realized with a sickening lurch that I would never be in. I thought of the $1,000 I had quietly set aside as a wedding gift, money scraped together by cutting corners on my own groceries and skipping the hair appointments I once loved. I thought of the calls I had made to my sister in Dallas, telling her how proud I was that David was finally marrying. I had cleaned my house top to bottom, scrubbing until my knees ached, imagining they might stop by afterward to celebrate with me. All of that hope, all of that anticipation reduced to ash by Melissa's 4 poisoned words. David finally lifted his head, and his eyes, once the eyes of the boy who used to run to me after nightmares, now seemed hollow, rehearsed. "Mom," he muttered, "it was an intimate thing. Just the 2 of us and the witnesses." His words were flat, memorized, a script fed to him by the woman beside him. But I knew better. My phone had already betrayed the truth. Social media, that unfiltered diary of pride, told me everything I wasn't meant to see. Melissa's parents grinning beside the happy couple, champagne glasses in hand. Her siblings' laughing arms draped around David as though he had always been theirs. And Melissa herself, radiant in the white gown I had unknowingly helped finance when I'd handed her $800 last month for personal expenses. I had paid for the dress. I had paid for the rings. I had even covered part of their honeymoon savings. And yet I was not invited to stand among them. My stomach twisted as I imagined Melissa posting those photographs with glee while I sat at home staring at an empty calendar. I thought of my late husband Robert and the promises we had made when David was born, that he would never feel alone, that we would always support him. I had kept that promise even after Robert passed, doubling my sacrifices so David would never lack. And now here I was excluded, erased, invisible. Melissa leaned back against the cushions with the kind of confidence that comes from victory. She didn't even bother hiding it. My hands tightened around the phone, though I had no words left to say. My tongue felt heavy, my heart heavier. I wanted to scream, to demand why, but no sound left my lips. The silence that filled the room was unbearable. Only the clock ticked, marking each second of my humiliation. I remembered every transfer, every check, every trip to the grocery store where I picked up Melissa's favorite yogurt, the brand she once sighed she couldn't afford. I remembered canceling my vacation to the coast so I could cover a sudden emergency with their car payment. I remembered sitting alone on Christmas Eve while they claimed they were too tired to visit, only to post pictures from Melissa's parents' house. And now the culmination of every sacrifice, every dollar, every sleepless night worrying about their bills was this: only special people were invited. The phrase burned into me, searing my pride, my love, my dignity. I could almost hear it echoing in my ears, bouncing off the walls of my home until I thought I might collapse under the weight of it. David shifted uneasily, his hands clasped together, his knuckles pale. He tried again, as if rehearsed. "It wasn't personal, Mom. It was just small. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing myself to breathe. My gaze drifted toward the window where the late afternoon light slanted across the floor, catching dust motes that danced like fragments of broken dreams. Small, he said, intimate, but not too small for Melissa's entire family. Not too intimate for champagne toasts and smiling photos, only small enough to exclude me. My vision blurred with tears, but I blinked them back. I would not cry in front of her. Not in front of the woman who had stolen not just my son's loyalty, but now the most precious day of his life. I pressed the phone to the receiver, ending the call that had never truly been mine, and set it down on the counter with a thud. My legs trembled, but I stayed standing, watching them as though from a great distance. For the first time in my life, I felt something I had never associated with my son: a chasm, a void where love should have been. I thought of the word wedding as I had once understood it, a union not just of two people, but of families. A day where mothers are cherished, honored, celebrated. But in my reality, the word had been twisted into a weapon, cutting me out like I was disposable. As Melissa reached for David's hand and smiled smugly, I realized this wasn't just about missing a ceremony. It was about being erased from my own child's life, treated as if my years of sacrifice had been nothing more than an ATM receipt. My body finally gave way, and I sank into the nearest chair, the same chair where I had written birthday cards, with tucked-in bills, where I had calculated rent transfers, where I had whispered silent prayers for their happiness. Now that chair bore witness to something else: the death of an illusion. I stared at David one last time, but he never met my eyes. And in that silence, with my heart breaking, I understood the truth that chilled me to the bone. In their world, I was not a mother. I was not family. I was not special. I was nothing at all. The morning after Melissa's words cut me open, I woke to a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. My green gown still hung on the closet door, where I'd left it, a cruel reminder that I had dressed my hopes in fabric I would never wear. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at it, my hands curled in my lap, and thought of every little plan I had made for that day. The hair appointment, the shoes, waiting in their box, the $1,000 folded neatly in an envelope for David, and his new wife. All of it meaningless now. I had prepared for a celebration, but what I got was an erasure. I shuffled into the kitchen and filled the kettle, the motion so familiar I could almost trick myself into thinking nothing had changed. But everything had. The air in my house felt different, sharper, as though the walls themselves knew I had been discarded. I placed my coffee mug on the counter, the same counter where I had stood the night before when Melissa told me I wasn't special. The words returned like a whisper I couldn't silence. Only special people were invited. By mid-morning, I found myself scrolling through social media again, punishing myself with the images I'd already seen. Melissa's parents in matching navy outfits, holding glasses of champagne. Her sister with her arm looped through David's, smiling like she had always belonged. The backyard strung with fairy lights, the cake decorated with pale roses, Melissa, radiant in the gown I had unknowingly funded. Every photograph was proof that the story David told me, that it had been just the two of them, and the witnesses was a lie rehearsed to keep me quiet. My phone buzzed with messages from neighbors who had seen the posts too. Beautiful wedding, one wrote. You must be so proud. I couldn't bring myself to answer. How could I explain that pride had been ripped from me, replaced with humiliation, so sharp I could barely breathe? At noon, I opened the drawer in my desk, where I kept my checkbook and bank statements. I pulled them out, laying them across the dining table in neat rows. For 3 years, I had written check after check, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself I was helping them get on their feet. $600 for rent, $200 for groceries, $300 here, $400 there, for emergencies that never seemed to end. I began adding the numbers in my head, then scribbling them down on a pad of paper. The total grew higher and higher, a mountain of sacrifice. By the time I finished, the sum stared back at me like a cruel truth: more than $30,000. $30,000 I had bled from my retirement account, the one Robert and I had built together, so I could live my later years in peace. $30,000 I had eaten beans and rice to save, skipping dinners out, ignoring the catalogs filled with dresses I no longer let myself buy. $30,000 I had funneled into a life that had no room for me. The tears came then, hot and relentless, and I let them. But they weren't the tears of a grieving mother. They were the tears of a woman who had finally seen the full shape of her own foolishness. I cried for every time I had smiled through being ignored, for every moment I had convinced myself that giving money was the same as being loved. I cried until my chest ached, until I could barely see the ink blurring on the page in front of me. When the sobs finally quieted, something inside me shifted. The ache didn't vanish, but it hardened, settling into something cold and sharp. I looked at the neat rows of numbers again and whispered aloud, "Never again." The words startled me. They sounded foreign, like they belonged to someone stronger than I had been yesterday. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized they belonged to me. That evening, the phone rang. David's name lit the screen, and for a split second my heart leapt foolishly, hoping he was calling to apologize, to explain, to say the words I needed so desperately to hear. "I'm sorry, Mom. You matter to me." But I didn't answer. I sat perfectly still and let it ring until it fell silent. Then it rang again. This time Melissa's name. Again I let it ring. 10 minutes later a message appeared. "Mom, please pick up. We need to talk." I deleted it without opening. Instead I went for a walk. The air was crisp with the first bite of autumn. I passed the park where I used to take David when he was small, remembering the way he would run across the grass and collapse into my arms sweaty, and laughing, telling me I was the best mom in the world. The memory stabbed at me so sweet it hurt. When had that little boy disappeared? When had he become this man who allowed his wife to look me in the eye and tell me I wasn't special? At the corner I stopped in front of the bank. Through the glass I saw Mr. Howard, the manager, sitting at his desk. He waved, as he always did, familiar from the countless times I had come in to transfer money into David and Melissa's account. I walked inside before I could change my mind. "Mrs. Crawford," he greeted me warmly. "Here to make the usual transfer." I shook my head. My voice trembled at first, but then steadied. "No, Mr. Howard. I'm here to cancel them. All of them. And I want to make sure no one else has access to my money ever again." His brows rose in surprise, but his eyes softened. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure," I said. I finally opened my eyes. While he processed the cancellations, my phone buzzed nonstop in my purse. I ignored it, staring instead at the paperwork Mr. Howard slid across the desk. Signing my name on those forms felt like shedding a skin I'd been trapped in for too long. "Mrs. Crawford," Mr. Howard said gently, "I've seen you be very generous over the years. I hope you're not being pressured into making these changes." His concern, so genuine from a man who only knew me through transactions, struck deeper than any kindness I had received from my son in years. I smiled faintly. On the contrary, for the first time I've stopped pressuring myself. When I stepped out of the bank, the air felt lighter, as though I had set down a burden I didn't realize I'd been carrying. My money was mine again. My life was mine again. I walked home slowly, watching the leaves tumble across the sidewalk, feeling the rhythm of my own footsteps steady and strong. For years, every errand had revolved around them, buying their groceries, paying their bills, fixing their problems. But today, for the first time in a long while, I had done something just for me. When I reached my front porch, I saw their car parked across the street. My stomach clenched, but instead of panic, I felt something else resolve. They still had keys to my house, keys I had given them when I believed trust and love were enough. As I opened my door, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: that would be the next thing to change. Because yesterday I was a woman erased from her own son's wedding. Today I was a woman who had begun reclaiming her life. And tomorrow I would be ready for the battle I knew was coming. I hadn't even had time to change the locks when it happened. Late the next afternoon, as I carried groceries up the porch steps, I noticed two cars parked at the curb: David's rust-colored sedan and a sleek black SUV I didn't recognize. My pulse quickened. Through the front window, I caught the movement of figures inside my living room. My living room. My hands went cold, the grocery bag nearly slipping from my grip. I pushed the door open with more force than I intended. The sight stopped me dead in my tracks. David sat hunched on the sofa, his head buried in his hands. Melissa paced like a restless cat, her heels clacking on the hardwood I had refinished with my own savings. And at my dining table, a table Robert had built decades ago, an older man in a gray suit shuffled through a stack of my personal documents. "What is happening here?" My voice was sharp, louder than I'd ever used with them. All three turned, as though I was the intruder in my own house. Melissa was the first to speak, her tone strained but syrupy. Helen, thank God you're here. We need to talk. This is Mr. Farley from the law firm we've consulted about your situation, my situation. The words sliced through me. What situation, I ask, steady despite the tremor in my chest. I'm doing perfectly fine. David lifted his face. His eyes, once bright, now clouded with panic, met mine. Mom, we went to the bank. They told us you canceled all the transfers, Mr. Farley explained. You also blocked our access to your accounts. We don't understand why. Mr. Farley rose smoothly, his smile polished, his hand extended. Mrs. Crawford, I'm here on behalf of your children. They're concerned about your well-being. I've been asked to evaluate whether you may require assistance with financial decisions. I didn't take his hand. Instead, I strode straight to the dining table and scooped up the papers he had no right to touch. Bank statements, retirement plans, even Robert's old insurance policies laid bare for strangers to inspect. My voice shook with fury. These are my private documents. You have no permission to review them. David's tone turned condescending, the same rehearsed calm he had used since Melissa entered his life. Mom, we're worried. You've been acting strange, cutting us off with no explanation, ignoring our calls. Maybe you need help, professional help. Melissa drifted closer, reaching for my hand with fake tenderness. Helen, sweetheart, maybe the loneliness is worse than you realize. At your age, episodes of confusion are normal. The word confusion echoed in my ears like an alarm. Now I understood. They weren't just begging anymore. They were building a case. They wanted to paint me as senile, incompetent, a burden to be managed, and most importantly, a wallet to be seized. I pulled my hand back. I am not confused, I declared, my voice iron. I am clearer than I have been in years, and you are going to leave my house right now. Mr. Farley tried to interject, using the calm authority lawyers wield like weapons. Mrs. Crawford, your children have a legal right to intervene if they believe your decision-making capacity is impaired. They've documented several concerning behaviors. I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Concerning behaviors, like deciding that my money belongs to me, like refusing to finance the lives of two adults who treat me like trash. Melissa stiffened, her eyes flashing. We never treated you badly. You're part of our family. Everything you have will belong to us one day anyway. We're just speeding up the process. Her words, so casually cruel, ripped away the last layer of pretense. There it was, the truth, naked and unvarnished. To them, I was already dead, a bank account with a pulse. Out, I said, pointing to the door. All of you out of my house. David stood, his face twisted with anger, the same petulant expression he had worn as a child when denied a toy. Mom, we can't just leave. We have obligations, the rent, the car payments, the credit cards you co-signed. You can't just cut us off. I can't. My voice rose, shaking the windows. Who says I can't? For years I paid rent, not in my name, filled a refrigerator in a house where I wasn't welcome, financed a life that had no place for me. And now you stand here with a lawyer daring to call me incompetent, Mr. Farley slid a folder across the table, his tone maddeningly even. We've prepared documents for you to consider, a power of attorney granting David and Melissa the ability to manage your finances. Just temporarily, until you're feeling more like yourself. I picked up the folder and, without opening it, tossed it straight into the trash can. The only transition happening here is yours to the front door. Melissa's face crumpled into tears, but I recognized them. Not sorrow, not guilt, frustration, manipulation. You can't do this, Helen. We were counting on you. We made plans, financial plans, because we knew we could rely on you. Plans built on my money, I shot back. Not my happiness. Not my company. Just my money. And now that I refuse, suddenly, I'm a confused old woman. David took a step forward, but I stepped back, holding my ground. He was no longer the boy who once clung to me after nightmares. He was a grown man who saw me only as an obstacle to a comfortable life. Mom, we made mistakes, he said, his voice coated with false remorse. The wedding, it was a misunderstanding. Melissa was nervous. We can fix this if you'll just be reasonable. Reasonable, I spat the word like poison. Reasonable means handing over every cent I have while you treat me like a stranger. Reasonable means pretending it didn't hurt to be excluded from my own son's wedding. If that's your definition of reasonable, then I want no part of it. Mr. Farley gathered his papers with brisk efficiency. Mrs. Crawford, this isn't over. Your family has legal options. If a judge believes you're incapable of managing your affairs, guardianship can be assigned." His words landed like a blow. This wasn't just manipulation. It was a real threat, a legal weapon they intended to wield against me. I lifted my chin, staring him down. "Then do your research, Mr. Farley. You'll find a 71-year-old woman who has managed her finances flawlessly for 4 decades, who raised her son alone after losing her husband, who worked until retirement with dignity, and who until last week supported 2 perfectly capable adults. If you think that makes me incompetent, I look forward to proving you wrong in court." Melissa's tears dried instantly, her expression hardening into pure venom. "This won't stay like this. We have rights, Helen. And we have lawyers." "Perfect," I replied coldly. "Hire all the lawyers you want with your own money. Mine is no longer available for your tantrums." They filed toward the door with the wounded dignity of people unaccustomed to being told no. Before he stepped out, David turned back, his eyes narrowed in a mixture of anger and threat. "This is going to end badly for you. You'll be alone, Mom. Alone with no one to take care of you when you need it most." I met his gaze, my voice quiet but unshakable. "David, I am already alone. The difference is now it's by my choice, not by your neglect." The door closed behind them with a finality that rattled the frame. I stood in my living room, surrounded by the most beautiful silence I had heard in years. It wasn't emptiness. It was freedom. That night I didn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because of adrenaline. My body hummed with it, my mind racing. They had shown their hand and I knew what came next: war. But this time I would not fight with tears or money. I would fight with clarity, with strategy, with every ounce of strength I had buried for far too long. At 6 in the morning, I was already dressed, my purse on my arm. My first stop was an attorney's office downtown, a man I remembered from handling Robert's will years ago. Unlike the mercenary Farley, this man had a reputation for integrity. And if David and Melissa wanted a war, I was ready to choose my general. Mr. Pierce Weber's office smelled faintly of leather and old books, the kind of place where truth seemed to carry weight. I sat across from him, my hands folded tightly in my lap while he listened without interruption. I told him everything, Melissa's cruel smile, David's silence, the bank transfers, the $30,000 that had bled from my savings, the confrontation in my living room with their lawyer rifling through my private papers. When my voice shook, Pierce leaned forward, his expression calm but resolute. "Helen," he said, "what your son and daughter-in-law attempted is called elder financial abuse. It is more common than you think, and in your case, it's well documented." The word abuse landed heavy in my chest. I had thought of it as betrayal, as manipulation, but abuse, that made it real, undeniable, ugly. Pierce opened a yellow legal pad and began writing. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we'll secure all your accounts. I'll draft a letter to your bank confirming that no one but you has authority. Second, we'll file documentation of your support over the last 3 years, every transfer, every check, every gift. We need to show a pattern. Third, we'll prepare in case they try to escalate legally, which they likely will. A guardianship petition isn't out of the question." Guardianship. The word tasted like ash. He nodded grimly. "They might try to declare you incompetent to seize control of your assets. It's an ugly tactic, but I've seen it before. That's why we'll also arrange a professional evaluation of your mental capacity. If they want to challenge you, we'll meet them with evidence stronger than their lies." I exhaled, the tightness in my chest loosening just slightly. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't alone. When I left Pierce's office, I carried a folder of documents and a list of tasks that felt less like burdens and more like weapons. The autumn sun was bright overhead as I stepped onto the street, and for a fleeting moment, I felt taller, lighter. My next stop was the hardware store. The bell above the door jingled, and Mr. Summers, the owner, greeted me with the familiarity of a man who had sold me countless supplies for David and Melissa's apartment over the years. "Mrs. Crawford, what brings you in today? Another emergency with your son's place." "Not this time," I said, my voice steady. "This time it's for my house. I need new locks, the best you have." His eyebrows shot up, but he didn't ask questions. Instead, he called for his son Ethan, who appeared from the back with a toolbox slung over his shoulder. "Ethan handles our security systems," Mr. Summers explained. "You're in luck." I turned to Ethan, a tall young man with kind eyes. "I need more than locks. I need cameras, a full system." "Price isn't an issue." Ethan nodded, professional. "We'll take care of it tomorrow morning." As they gathered the supplies, I felt a peculiar sense of irony. I was installing a security system not against strangers but against my own son. The thought twisted my stomach, yet the decision didn't shake. Trust was a luxury I could no longer afford. Back at home, I laid the new locks on the counter and boiled water for tea. My phone buzzed with calls I ignored, but then a new number flashed on the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. Melissa's voice spilled through feigning warmth. "Please don't hang up. We need to talk like civilized adults." "Speak," I said flatly. "I understand you're upset about the wedding. It was a mistake. David and I want to make it up to you. How about a dinner just us to celebrate? We could do it at your house, cook together like before." Her words were honeyed poison. "Melissa," I said slowly, "how much rent do you owe?" There was a pause, then a stammer. 2 months. 1,200 total. "But that's not why I'm calling. We miss you." "Do you miss me?" I asked, "or my money silence?" Then with a surprising honesty, she whispered both. The bluntness almost made me laugh. "Melissa, if I was so important, why wasn't I important enough to be at your wedding? Why don't I get calls that aren't about money? When was the last time you asked how I was doing?" The line went dead quiet. We both knew the answer. "I'll explain this," once I said finally. "For 3 years you treated me like an ATM with feelings. You ignored me, humiliated me, and finally insulted me in the worst way possible. Now that the money is gone, you suddenly discover love. No. You made your choice when you told me I wasn't special. Now I'm making mine." And I hung up. That afternoon I drove to the beauty salon I hadn't stepped into for over a year. The familiar scent of hairspray and lavender shampoo wrapped around me as Cynthia, my favorite stylist, lit up in surprise. "Helen, I thought you'd forgotten us." "I didn't forget you," I said softly. "I forgot myself." She guided me to the chair, draping a cape over my shoulders. "So what are we doing today?" "Everything," I answered. "Cut, color, manicure, pedicure." For the first time in years, I let someone tend to me without guilt gnawing at my chest. As Cynthia snipped and painted, we talked about her kids, her dreams, her life, conversations that had nothing to do with David or Melissa. When she finished, I hardly recognized the woman in the mirror. My hair shone, my nails gleamed, and more than that, my eyes held a spark I hadn't seen in years. "You look beautiful," Cynthia said, "but more than that, you look free." "Did something good happen?" I smiled at my reflection. "Yes, I finally learned to say no." That evening, I carried a bag of groceries to my car and noticed an older woman sitting on the steps of my porch. Her silver hair glowed in the fading light. "Mrs. Crawford?" she asked as I approached. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "Can I help you?" She extended a hand. "I'm Eleanor Brooks. I live next door. We've never had a chance to talk. Yesterday I heard loud voices from your house and I got worried. Are you all right?" Her genuine concern struck me deeper than any call from David ever had. "Come in," I said. "I'll make us some coffee, and I'll tell you a story you won't believe." We sat at my kitchen table, and as the steam rose from our mugs, I recounted everything: the wedding, the exclusion, the betrayal, the lawyer in my dining room. Eleanor listened without interrupting, nodding gently, her eyes shining with empathy. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Helen, you did the right thing. I went through the same with my daughter 5 years ago. I thought if I stopped paying, I'd lose her love. But when I finally said no, I gained something else: peace. Real love can't be bought." Her words wrapped around me like a blanket. For the first time in a long time, I believed them. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Eleanor's words echoing in my mind. I thought about Robert, about the promises I'd broken to myself, about the strength I was only now discovering. And for the first time since the humiliation of hearing Melissa's poisoned words, I drifted to sleep without tears, dreaming not of what I had lost, but of what I might still gain. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, the hum of determination replacing the heaviness that had lingered for weeks. By 8 o'clock, Ethan and Miss Summers were on my doorstep with boxes of locks and sleek black cameras. As they carried the equipment inside, I brewed a pot of coffee, the smell filling the house with warmth that felt oddly like hope. "Mrs. Crawford," Ethan said as he laid the boxes on the floor, "will replace every lock in the house, install cameras at the entrances, and connect them to your phone. If anyone tries to enter without your permission, the police will be alerted immediately." I nodded, clutching my mug with both hands. "Thank you, Ethan. It's strange, isn't it, to protect yourself from your own family?" His expression softened. "Strange, maybe, but not uncommon. More people go through this than you'd think." While they worked, my phone vibrated over and over across the counter. Unknown numbers, David's number, Melissa's number, all ignored. I had learned to let silence be my shield. By noon, the last camera was up, the locks were changed, and Ethan handed me a small remote and a printed guide. "You're safe now," he said, with quiet confidence. Safe. The word felt foreign yet soothing. When the men left, I sat at my dining table and opened my address book. My fingers hovered over a familiar name before I dialed. My sister Diana answered on the second ring, her voice warm and surprised. "Helen, oh my goodness, I thought you'd forgotten me." Tears pricked my eyes. "I could never forget you, Diana. I just lost myself for a while." I told her everything: the wedding I wasn't invited to, the $30,000 gone, the lawyer in my dining room, the locks now changed. There was silence on the line as I spoke, and when I finished, Diana exhaled heavily. "Sister, it was about time. Every call we've had these past few years, all you ever talked about was how much money you'd given them, as if love could be measured in dollars. I wanted to tell you it wasn't right, but I didn't know how." Her words hurt, but not in the way I expected. They felt like disinfectant poured over a wound, painful but cleansing. "What do you mean?" I whispered. "David never spoke about you with love, Helen. Not once. At gatherings, it was always, 'Mom paid for this, Mom bought that.' Never, 'I love my mom' or 'I miss her.' And Melissa, well, she always talked about you in the future tense. When Helen is gone, we'll remodel her house. When we inherit, we'll invest." Like they were counting down the days. I pressed a trembling hand to my mouth. The truth stung worse than any insult Melissa had ever thrown at me. "Do you understand now?" Diana's voice was gentle but firm. "They don't see you as a person. They see you as money. And you deserve more than that." We spoke for another hour, our words stitching back the sisterhood I had let unravel. By the time we hung up, my chest felt both raw and lighter, as though a heavy fog had begun to lift. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery for the first time in months. The gravel crunched beneath my tires, and the air was thick with the scent of pine. Robert's grave sat in the far corner beneath a maple tree, the stones slightly weathered, the flowers I had left last time now wilted. I knelt on the grass, brushing dirt from the engraving with my fingertips. "Robert," I whispered, my voice breaking, "I think I lost myself after you died. I thought if I poured everything into David, I could make up for the hole you left. But I was wrong. Our son doesn't see me anymore. Or maybe he never did." The breeze rustled through the branches above me, and for a moment, it felt like he was listening. "They used the money you left me. They drained what you wanted me to live on. But it's over now. I've learned, Robert. I've finally learned." I replaced the wilted flowers with fresh ones from the florist down the street, tidied the grave, and sat for another hour simply breathing in the peace. For once, I didn't feel the tug of urgency to run home to cover David and Melissa's latest crisis. The only urgency I felt was to reclaim my own life. When I returned home, the cameras flashed. As I approached the door, a small ping on my phone confirming they were working. Inside, I set the groceries down and found a message blinking on my answering machine. Melissa's voice filled the room, desperate and shaking. "Helen, it's me. Please, you have to call us back. We're 2 months behind on rent. The landlord is threatening eviction. You forgot to make the transfer. Forgot." The audacity of the word made my blood run hot. Her voice trembled. "Please, Helen. You're like a second mother to me. We need you. We can't do this without you." I deleted the message. The next morning, there was a knock at my door. My phone showed me the camera feed Eleanor holding a mug of coffee. I opened the door and she smiled warmly. "I thought you might like some company. We sat together sipping coffee, and I told her about Diana, about the cemetery, about Melissa's message. Eleanor listened carefully, nodding her eyes, shining with understanding. "You're stronger than you think," she said. "I know it hurts, but one day you'll realize this isn't just loss, it's freedom." That night I lay in bed, the house quiet, except for the hum of the new security system. For the first time in years, I didn't fall asleep worrying about whether David had paid his bills, whether Melissa had food in the fridge. Instead, I thought about the art class flyer pinned to the community board at the market. I thought about calling Diana again to plan a visit. And I drifted into sleep with the kind of peace I hadn't felt in decades, unaware that David and Melissa were already planning their next move, one that would drag me into a battle fiercer than I had ever faced. I noticed their cars before I even turned into the driveway. David's sedan, Melissa's SUV, and another silver vehicle I didn't recognize sat lined up at the curb like predators waiting. My stomach dropped, but instead of parking, I slowed to a crawl and reached for my phone. Through the new cameras, I saw movement inside, three figures pacing, rifling through drawers, my dining table covered in papers again. My papers. I sat in the car, my pulse racing. They still had keys, of course. Keys I had given them back when trust had been a language between us. I should have changed the lock sooner, but Ethan and Mr. Summers were scheduled for tomorrow. Too late for today. I took a long, steadying breath before stepping out. My shoes clicked hard on the pavement as I walked to the front door. I didn't hesitate this time, I shoved it open. David was slouched on the sofa, his face pale, eyes darting. Melissa paced like a caged animal, her voice a hiss. And at the table sat a man in a sharp gray suit, his hair slicked back, riffling through my financial folders as if they belonged to him. "What is happening here?" My voice was louder than I intended, but I welcomed the force in it. They all turned. Melissa rushed forward, first, her expression a performance of relief. "Helen, thank God you're here. We need to talk. This is Mr. Fisher from the law firm. We're just trying to help you." "Help me?" I moved past her, straight to the table. I yanked the papers from under the stranger's hands and clutched them to my chest. "These are my private documents. You have no right." The lawyer stood smoothly, offering a hand I ignored. "Mrs. Crawford, I'm Dr. Fisher. Your children are concerned about your mental well-being. They asked me to assess whether you may need assistance managing your finances." My blood ran hot. "My finances? Which of you pays my mortgage? Which of you paid for this furniture, this roof, these walls? Not $1 came from you. And yet, here you are picking through my life like vultures." David lifted his head, trying on that calm, condescending tone. "Mom, we're worried. You've been acting strange. Canceling transfers, ignoring calls. We think loneliness is affecting you more than you realize." Melissa tried to take my hand, her voice soft, coaxing. "Helen, sweetie, at your age, it's normal to get confused sometimes. We just want to protect you." I pulled my hand back as if she'd burned me. "I am not confused. I am more clear than I've been in years, and I see you for exactly what you are." The lawyer interjected smoothly. "Mrs. Crawford, your children have rights. If they believe your capacity is impaired, they can petition the court. It's best for everyone if you sign a power of attorney just until you feel better." I picked up the folder he slid toward me. Without opening it, I walked to the trash can and dropped it in. The thud echoed. "The only thing I'm signing is the order for you to leave my house." Melissa's mask cracked. Her eyes narrowed, her lips curled. "We never treated you badly. You're part of this family. Everything you have will belong to us anyway. We're just speeding it up." The words hit like a slap, but strangely they didn't shatter me. They crystallized everything. To them I was already dead, and they were circling the inheritance like carrion. "Out," I said, pointing to the door. "All of you. Out now." David's face twisted, the boy I raised gone, replaced by a man consumed by entitlement. "Mom, we can't just walk away. We've got bills, rent, car loans, credit cards you co-signed. You can't just cut us off." "Can't?" My voice shook the air. "Who says I can't? I have paid for years. I have sacrificed everything while you treated me like I was invisible. And now I'm done." Fisher gathered his briefcase unfazed. "Mrs. Crawford, this isn't over. If a judge determines you're making irrational decisions, guardianship will be assigned. I stepped closer, my voice steel. Then do your research, Mr. Fisher. You'll find a woman who raised her son alone, worked until retirement, and managed her accounts without one mistake for 40 years. If that's incompetence, I welcome your lawsuit. Melissa's eyes glistened with false tears, but her voice dripped venom. This won't stay like this. We have lawyers too. Perfect, I said coldly. Hire them with your own money. Mine isn't yours anymore. They shuffled toward the door, but David paused on the threshold. He looked back, his voice sharp with threat. This is going to end badly for you, Mom. You'll be alone when you need someone most. I met his eyes with a calm I hadn't felt in years. David, I've already been alone. The difference now is that it's by my choice, not your neglect. The door slammed behind them, leaving the house in silence. But this time it wasn't the silence of loss. It was freedom. I stood there for a long time, the papers still clutched to my chest, my heartbeat finally slowing. I knew they wouldn't stop. I knew Melissa's ambition and David's weakness would drive them to escalate. But I also knew something else. I was ready. That night I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, writing a list like a general preparing for war. Call Pierce first thing tomorrow. Schedule capacity evaluation. Secure a restraining order. Change every lock, every code. Rewrite my will. I underlined the last point 3 times. At dawn, I brewed coffee and packed my purse. The folder of documents weighed heavy inside, but it felt less like a burden than a shield. As the sun rose, I stepped outside, locking the door behind me with a new determination. They wanted to strip me of my dignity, my autonomy, my life's work. But they had forgotten something. I wasn't just a mother. I was a survivor. Pierce's office felt like a fortress that morning, sunlight streaming through tall windows, casting everything in sharp clarity. He looked up from the stack of documents I had given him, his brow furrowed. Helen, what they tried to do yesterday is serious. We're not just talking about manipulation anymore. This is elder financial abuse, and now they're making moves to control you legally. The words landed like stones. Abuse. Legal control. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to sit straighter. So what do we do? Pierce leaned back, steepling his fingers. We prepare for war. First, we're going to document every transfer you've made to them in the past 3 years. Bank records, receipts, anything you have. We'll build a clear picture of how much support you've provided. Second, we'll get ahead of their guardianship tactic. I'm arranging for you to undergo a full psychiatric and cognitive evaluation with Dr. Moore, one of the most respected specialists in the state. Once she clears you, their claims will have no teeth. And the house, I asked, my voice quiet. They still had keys. They walked right in. Change every lock, Pierce said firmly. Install your cameras. And Helen, document every time they show up without permission. The more evidence we have, the better. I nodded, relief and dread mingling in my chest. For once I wasn't walking into this alone. By afternoon, Ethan was back, tools in hand. He worked quickly, swapping out the old locks for gleaming new ones, setting up motion-activated cameras at every entrance. You'll be able to see everything from your phone, he explained, showing me the app. If anyone tries to break in, the system alerts you and the police instantly. Watching him work, I felt something strange, peace. Not because I thought David and Melissa would give up, but because I finally had walls they couldn't breach. That evening, Eleanor stopped by with a casserole, her silver hair pulled back in a bun. Thought you might not have had time to cook, she said with a smile. She sat with me while the cameras blinked softly in the background. I don't know what I'd do without you, I admitted. You won't have to find out, she replied, patting my hand. The next morning, Pierce called. Helen, I've set up your appointment with Dr. Moore. Tomorrow at 10. Bring nothing but yourself. She'll take care of the rest. I thanked him and hung up, my heart thudding. Tomorrow a stranger would measure my mind, test my clarity, and my freedom might depend on it. That night sleep came only in fragments. I dreamed of Melissa whispering to a judge that I was senile, of David standing by silently as my bank account was drained. I woke with sweat clinging to my skin, the sheets twisted around me. At dawn, I drove to the cemetery again, needing Robert's steadiness before facing what was to come. The maple tree above his grave had begun to shed its leaves, scattering gold across the grass. Robert, I whispered, kneeling by the stone. They're trying to say I can't take care of myself. Can you believe that after all these years, after raising David alone, working 2 jobs, paying every bill on time, they want to strip me of everything? The wind stirred softly, brushing my cheek like an answer. But I won't let them, I said, my voice hardening. I've found people who believe me, and tomorrow I'll prove it. Not just to them, but to myself. The next morning, I walked into Dr. Moore's office with my head high. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes that seemed to see right through pretense. Mrs. Crawford, she said warmly, today isn't about trick questions. It's about showing what you already know, that you are fully capable of making your own decisions. For 2 hours, she tested me. Memory exercises, problem-solving, financial reasoning, even abstract puzzles. I answered each one with focus, my mind sharper than I expected after so many sleepless nights. At the end, she smiled. Helen, your results are excellent, better than many people 20 years younger. You have nothing to fear from their accusations. Tears welled in my eyes, but this time they weren't from pain, they were from vindication. When I left her office, Pierce was waiting in the lobby. How'd it go? I handed him the sealed envelope Dr. Moore had given me. She said I'm better than some 40-year-olds. He chuckled, but his eyes remained serious. Good. We'll keep this safe. Because Helen, make no mistake, they will try again. But now we're ready. That night, I sat by the window watching the camera's feeds on my phone. The empty street, the still yard, the blinking light of security, it all felt like armor. I sipped my tea and whispered to myself, let them come. I'm not the woman they used to know. And as the clock struck midnight, I realized something astonishing. For the first time in decades, I wasn't afraid of tomorrow. I was prepared for it. The knock came just after 9 on a chilly Thursday morning. I glanced at the camera feed before answering, and my breath caught. David stood on my porch, shoulders slumped, Melissa beside him with arms crossed tight against her chest. A folded piece of paper peeked from David's jacket pocket. I already knew what it was before I even opened the door. Mom, David began, his tone rehearsed. We didn't want it to come to this, but you've left us no choice. Melissa's eyes glittered with triumph as she slid the paper from David's pocket and held it out. Consider yourself served. Petition for guardianship. We'll see you in court. I took the document, my hand steady, though my stomach lurched. Get off my porch, I said evenly, then shut the door before they could reply. At the kitchen table, I unfolded the petition. The words leapt off the page like poison, claims of increasing forgetfulness, irrational financial decisions, episodes of paranoia. They had listed every canceled transfer as evidence of instability. The nerve of it. Canceling their rent payments had become erratic behavior. Protecting my own savings had become dangerous confusion. I called Pierce immediately. He answered on the first ring. They served you, yes. My voice didn't tremble this time. They want guardianship. Good, he said firmly. Now it's official. We'll fight it head on. Remember what Dr. Moore gave you. That evaluation is our shield. Meet me in my office tomorrow morning. We'll prepare everything. That night, I barely slept, but not from fear. I spent hours at the dining table with my files spread around me like weapons, bank statements, receipts, handwritten notes of every payment I had made for them. $30,000 of proof. Proof of generosity turned against me. Proof I could now wield. By the time dawn broke, I felt strangely calm. The war had moved from whispers and manipulations to the bright light of a courtroom, and I was ready. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and cold stone. My heels echoed against the marble floor as I walked beside Pierce, the sealed evaluation from Dr. Moore tucked safely in his briefcase. David and Melissa waited near the courtroom doors. Melissa, in a crisp navy suit, David, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Melissa, however, smiled with a predator's confidence. Inside, the judge sat high above us, her expression unreadable. We are here for the matter of guardianship concerning Mrs. Helen Crawford, she began. Petitioners, please present your case. Melissa took the stand first, her voice dripping with false concern. Your Honor, we love Helen, but lately she's been making irrational choices. She canceled our rent transfers, suddenly leaving us facing eviction. She refuses to answer our calls. She lashes out unpredictably. We believe she's no longer capable of managing her affairs, and we want to ensure her safety. Her performance might have fooled someone who hadn't lived through it. Not me. When it was my turn, Pierce guided me gently to the stand. I held my head high. "Mrs. Crawford," he asked, "why did you cancel the transfers?" I looked directly at the judge. "Because for 3 years I supported 2 capable adults. I paid their rent, their groceries, their car payments. Over $30,000 in total. I believed it was temporary. But when I asked about my son's wedding, I was told I wasn't special enough to attend. The very people draining my savings excluded me from the most important day of my son's life. That's when I realized love doesn't come through money." And I stopped. A ripple went through the courtroom. Melissa's face hardened, her mask cracking. Pierce handed me a stack of documents. "Can you identify these?" "Yes," I said clearly. "Bank records, copies of checks, receipts. Every dollar I gave them." "Thank you," Pierce said, then opened the envelope from Dr. Moore. "And finally, Your Honor, we submit an independent psychiatric and cognitive evaluation completed last week. It concludes Mrs. Crawford is fully competent, mentally sharp, and entirely capable of managing her own finances." The judge read in silence for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she looked up. "Mrs. Crawford, you've passed with flying colors. There is no evidence of incompetence. Petition denied." Melissa shot to her feet. "But Your Honor, she's confused. She's being manipulated by outsiders." The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and final. "Sit down, Mrs. Crawford. This matter is closed." For a moment, the world blurred. Relief, hot and fierce, surged through me. Justice, swift, undeniable, had been served. As I left the courtroom, David brushed past me without a word, his face pale, his jaw tight. Melissa hissed. This isn't over, but her voice shook with something new, fear. Outside, the autumn air tasted sweeter than wine. Eleanor had come to sit in the gallery, and she hugged me tight on the courthouse steps. "You did it," she whispered. "No," I said softly. "We did it. Pierce, Dr. Moore, you, Diana, you all reminded me who I am. For the first time in years, I wasn't a woman begging for scraps of love. I was a woman who had fought for her dignity and won." That night I sat on my porch, the cameras blinking faintly in the dark, the lock secure, the silence profound. I thought about Melissa's cold smile the day she told me I wasn't special. I thought about $30,000 spent trying to buy what should have been freely given. And I thought about the judge's words, petition denied. Justice wasn't just served in that courtroom. It had seeped into me steady and unshakable. But deep down, I knew Melissa wasn't finished. She would try again. And next time she might not come with lawyers, she might come with desperation. I sipped my tea, watching the quiet street, and whispered to myself, "Let her come. I'm not afraid anymore." The first sign that Melissa wasn't finished came a week after the hearing. I had just returned from the market, arms full of fresh bread and fruit, when I spotted a white envelope tucked under my front door. My name was scrawled across the front in David's handwriting, uneven and urgent. I didn't need to open it to feel the weight of manipulation inside. Still, I tore it open at the kitchen counter, bracing myself. "Mom," the letter began, "please reconsider. Melissa and I are drowning. Without your help, we can't survive. If you don't step in, we'll lose the apartment, the car, everything. You've always said family takes care of each other. Please prove it now." The irony nearly made me laugh. Family takes care of each other, but where had that philosophy been when they planned a wedding and left me out? When they whispered that I wasn't special enough to stand beside them, I folded the letter neatly and dropped it into the trash. That evening, the phone rang from a blocked number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Mom, David's voice crackled through the line, heavy with tension. "I know you're angry, but please. This isn't about the wedding anymore. We're desperate. The landlord is threatening eviction." "And whose fault is that?" I asked calmly. "Yours." Melissa's voice cut in sharply, as if she had grabbed the phone from him. "You pulled the rug out from under us. You can't just stop supporting us out of nowhere." I held the receiver a moment, stunned at her audacity. "Melissa," I said, "finally you're right about one thing." I stopped. But it wasn't out of nowhere. It was after years of giving, years of sacrifice. And after the day you looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't special, that was the last straw. Silence. Then Melissa's hiss, venomous and low. "You'll regret this." Click. The line went dead. That night, unease kept me awake. I replayed Melissa's tone in my mind, less pleading, more threatening. By morning, I resolved to call Pierce. He listened carefully as I explained, then sighed. Helen, this is escalation. They've realized manipulation won't work, so they're shifting to intimidation. We'll document everything. If threats continue, we'll involve the police again. True to his prediction, the harassment didn't stop. A few days later, my neighbor Eleanor knocked on my door with concern etched across her face. Helen, I don't want to alarm you, but I saw Melissa outside last night. She was sitting in her car across the street for nearly an hour just watching your house. My stomach clenched. Watching, yes. Lights off, engine running. I wrote down the time in case you need it. Bless Eleanor, she knew exactly how to turn fear into evidence. The following week, another tactic emerged. A young woman arrived at my doorstep with a clipboard introducing herself as a social worker. We received a report of possible neglect, she explained, her tone professional but skeptical. Do you mind if I come in? Immediately my instincts screamed Melissa. I called Pierce before answering. Within half an hour, he was at my side waving his credentials at the startled woman. Unless you have a court order, this visit is harassment fueled by false reports. Leave now. The social worker hesitated, then retreated, muttering apologies, but the damage had been done. Melissa had tried to turn the state against me. That night, as I sat at my dining table staring at the flicker of the security camera feed, I realized how far my daughter-in-law was willing to go. This wasn't about survival anymore, it was about conquest. If she couldn't control me through guilt, she would try through force. I opened my journal and began writing everything down: dates, times, threats, letters, sightings, a paper trail of their desperation. Each entry was a shield for the battles to come. Meanwhile, my life outside of their chaos was slowly blossoming. I had joined an art class downtown where I spent afternoons painting sunflowers and meeting people who asked nothing of me but friendship. I took long walks with Eleanor, our conversations flowing easily about books, recipes, even plans for a trip to Santa Fe in the spring. It was in those peaceful moments that I understood Melissa's fury was the sound of losing control. And my joy, fragile though it was proof she no longer had it. One Sunday morning, as I sipped tea on my porch, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unfamiliar number, but I recognized Melissa's phrasing immediately. Enjoy your freedom while you can. We have lawyers too. I saved the text, then deleted the number from my phone. For years, I had been their lifeline. Now each threat only hardened my resolve. Later that day, Diana called from Dallas. I've heard rumors, Helen. They're telling people you've gone senile. My throat tightened. Of course they are. It's their last weapon. Do you want me to fly down? She asked gently. I almost said yes. But then I looked around my bright, orderly home at the security cameras, at the thick folder of documents on my desk. No, Diana. I can handle this. I'm stronger than I've ever been. And I meant it. The weeks that followed were a strange rhythm of peace and tension: mornings filled with art, afternoons with friends, evenings shadowed by the possibility of Melissa's next move. Yet beneath it all, a quiet fire burned. Every time I looked at my bank statements, untouched, secure, I felt that fire grow stronger. They could circle my house. They could spread lies. They could file petitions. But they could no longer control me. As I closed my journal one evening, I wrote a final line across the page. The war isn't over, but for once I'm fighting on my own terms. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, the kind of scent that clings to rooms where too many lives have been decided. I sat at the long oak table beside Pierce, my hands clasped tight in my lap, willing them not to shake. Across from me sat David and Melissa, dressed as if this were a funeral. In some ways, maybe it was the funeral of the family I once believed I had. Judge Whitman, a man with silver hair and a reputation for fairness, entered the room. We all rose and the air thickened with tension. My son avoided my eyes, but Melissa's gaze met mine, sharp and cold like a blade meant to cut. Their attorney, a polished man named Gregory Lane, wasted no time. He stood and addressed the court with a solemn expression, his voice dripping with practiced concern. Your Honor, we are here today because Mrs. Helen Crawford, age 68, has demonstrated alarming behaviors that suggest she can no longer responsibly manage her affairs. Her abrupt withdrawal of financial support from her only son and daughter-in-law after years of consistent aid indicates irrationality. She has isolated herself, installed excessive security systems, and refused family care. These are classic signs of paranoia and decline. We asked the court to appoint her son as guardian to ensure her well-being. Each word was like a nail hammered into the coffin they wanted to build around me. Pierce leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. Let him hang himself with his own rope." Then came the parade of their witnesses. First was Melissa. She dabbed at imaginary tears with a tissue, her voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. Helen was like a second mother to me. We used to cook together, laugh together. But in the last year, she's changed. She's cold, suspicious. She even accused us of stealing when all we wanted was to help her manage her money responsibly. Pierce stood for the cross-examination. "Mrs. Crawford," he said smoothly, "when was the last time you called Helen without asking her for money?" Melissa faltered. We talked all the time. A specific date, please." She shifted in her seat. "I can't recall. Is it true that you and your husband married without inviting her?" Melissa flushed. "It was a small ceremony." "Is it also true that when Helen asked about it, you told her only special people were invited?" Her lips tightened. "That was taken out of context." "What context makes it acceptable to tell a mother-in-law she isn't special enough to be at her own son's wedding?" The silence stretched until the judge cleared his throat and Melissa finally looked down at her lap. David was next. Seeing him swear an oath to tell the truth felt like a cruel joke. He spoke about my supposed confusion, how I had stopped answering calls, how I had fallen under the influence of neighbors. "I worry every day," he said, his voice shaking with a performance that would have made me proud if it weren't a lie. "My mom raised me alone. She was my rock. Now she's not herself. I just want to protect her." Pierce rose again. "Mr. Crawford, how much money has your mother given you and your wife over the last 3 years?" David hesitated. "I don't know the exact amount. Would $33,400 sound correct?" David's jaw tightened. "Maybe." "She was always generous." "And how many times have you visited your mother without asking her for financial assistance?" He said nothing. The silence was answer enough. "Is it true you entered her home without permission and reviewed her private documents?" David's eyes darted toward Melissa. "We were worried about her." "And is it true you brought a lawyer to pressure her into signing a power of attorney?" "We thought it would make things easier." "Easier for whom?" Pierce pressed. "For a 68-year-old woman who paid your rent, your bills, your groceries, or for you and your wife who no longer had to worry about responsibility?" David's mouth opened, but no words came. Then came their so-called neutral witness, Mr. Davis, my grumpy neighbor across the street. He described how I had installed cameras like I was preparing for war and hosted strange visitors. Pierce's questions unraveled his testimony quickly. "Did you ever speak directly with Mrs. Crawford about these concerns?" "No. So your claims are based entirely on what you saw from across the street?" "Well, yes, but no further questions." Finally, they presented Dr. Lehman, who suggested my refusal to undergo his evaluation was proof of decline. But Pierce countered with a thick file. Dr. Moore's evaluation of me detailed professional and airtight. She later testified herself, explaining calmly that my cognitive performance was not just normal, but above average for my age. When it was my turn, I stood and walked to the witness stand. My legs trembled, but my voice did not. Pierce guided me gently. "Mrs. Crawford, why did you stop supporting your son and daughter-in-law financially?" "Because I realized what I was giving wasn't love," I said clearly, my voice echoing in the hushed room. "It was a transaction. My money was wanted, but I was not. When I asked about their wedding, I was told I wasn't special enough. That day, something inside me broke. I have the right to say no, to use my resources for my own life, not to fuel the irresponsibility of 2 adults in their 30s. "Do you regret your decision?" I swallowed hard, then shook my head. "Only that it took me so long." Gregory Lane tried to rattle me on cross-examination, suggesting I had been manipulated by Eleanor and others. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Crawford, that your neighbors influenced you to turn against your own family?" I met his gaze. "My neighbors gave me friendship. They never asked me for a dime. That's more than I can say for my own son." In closing arguments, Gregory painted me as a paranoid old woman alienated by greedy outsiders. But Pierce's rebuttal was sharp and simple. Your Honor, what you have heard is not evidence of incompetence. It is evidence of independence. My client has chosen to stop financing people who exclude her, manipulate her, and threaten her. That isn't decline, it's clarity. The judge recessed for deliberation. 2 hours stretched like 2 years. I sat in the hall staring at the marble floor. Memories flickering, David's childhood laughter, Melissa's first Christmas in our home, all the times I thought love was something you could buy. When we were called back, my heart hammered against my ribs. Judge Whitman adjusted his glasses and looked at me. After reviewing all testimony, evidence, and evaluations, it is clear to this court that Mrs. Helen Crawford is fully competent. The petition for guardianship is denied. Furthermore, the court warns the petitioners that continued harassment may result in legal consequences. A wave of relief crashed over me. Tears filled my eyes, not of sadness, but of freedom. Across the room, Melissa's face contorted with rage, and David's shoulders slumped as if the air had been knocked from him. I walked out of that courthouse taller than I had in years. The autumn sun hit my face, and for the first time I felt truly alive. Beside me, Pierce smiled. Justice served Helen. And not just in law, but in life. I exhaled slowly. The war wasn't over, they might try again, but today I had won. And that victory was mine to keep. The first morning after the trial, I woke up without the usual knot in my stomach. For months, I had opened my eyes expecting another battle, another trick, another betrayal waiting in the wings. But that day, sunlight streamed through my curtains, and instead of fear, I felt something lighter, almost foreign peace. I brewed coffee, the smell filling my kitchen like an old friend. My phone sat on the counter silent at last. No calls from blocked numbers, no texts begging for rent money, no manipulative messages masked as concern. I scrolled through my bank app, and for once the numbers staring back belonged entirely to me. Not David. Not Melissa. Me. Later that morning, Eleanor knocked at the door with her usual warm smile. I thought we should celebrate, she said, holding a basket of fresh muffins. We sat at my dining table, the same table where Melissa once rifled through my documents without permission, and this time the only papers spread out were my art sketches. To new beginnings, Eleanor toasted with her coffee mug. I smiled, feeling the words settle in my bones. To freedom. Over the next week, I began to rebuild my life in small but meaningful ways. I signed up for more art classes, bought myself a new set of brushes, and even scheduled a short trip to Santa Fe, something I had always postponed because David or Melissa needed urgent help. For the first time in years, my calendar was filled with my plans, not theirs. But even as I embraced this freedom, reminders of the past lingered. At the grocery store, I overheard 2 women talking near the bakery. One whispered, "That's the woman whose son tried to put her under guardianship." Their pitying glances stung, but I lifted my chin and walked past. I wasn't ashamed. If anything, I pitied them for believing a mother's worth could be measured in money. A few days later, Diana flew in from Dallas. She hugged me so tightly at the airport, I nearly lost my breath. "Helen, you look 10 years younger," she laughed, pulling back to study me. "Freedom is better than any wrinkle cream," I replied, and we both laughed until tears ran down our faces. That evening, we sat on my porch watching the sun dip behind the Rockies. I told her everything. The threats, the false reports, the lies Melissa wove so smoothly. Diana listened quietly, her hand resting over mine. "You know," she said finally, "Mom used to warn us that money can poison family faster than anything else." I didn't believe her then. But looking at what David and Melissa did, her voice broke and she shook her head. "It makes me so angry." I stared at the horizon, the sky painted orange and violet. "It doesn't make me angry anymore. It makes me sad." I lost my son long before that trial. Maybe the boy I raised still exists somewhere inside him, but the man Melissa shaped, he's a stranger to me. Diana squeezed my hand. "Then maybe it's time to stop mourning and start living." Her words became my compass. The following weeks were filled with new rhythms. I joined Eleanor's garden club and discovered a circle of women who had their own stories of family betrayal, inheritance fights, cheating spouses, and greedy children. Around that circle, laughter mingled with tears as we shared our scars. Maria, a widow in her 70s, confided, "My brother drained our parents' estate before I even knew what was happening. It took me years to forgive myself for letting it happen." Carmen added, "My daughter only visits when she needs money for her business. I cut her off last year, and though it broke my heart, it also gave me back my peace." Alfreda, the eldest at 80, nodded solemnly. They all read from the same script. First they flatter you, then they create emergencies. Finally they question your sanity. I've seen it too many times. Their voices wove into mine a tapestry of survival and resilience. For the first time I didn't feel alone. One afternoon after class, Cynthia, my hairstylist turned friend, convinced me to try something bold. "Helen, let's refresh your look. New color, maybe even highlights. You deserve it." I laughed nervously but agreed. 2 hours later, I barely recognized the woman staring back in the salon mirror. My hair gleamed with soft golden streaks, my eyes brighter, my smile freer. Cynthia clapped her hands. "See, that's not just hair. That's a declaration." And it was. Still, shadows lingered at the edges of my new life. Twice I noticed Melissa's car parked near the grocery store. Once I spotted David across the street as I watered my garden. They never approached, never spoke, but their presence was a reminder that the war might not be over. When I told Pierce, he reassured me. "Document it, Helen. Every sighting, every car, every shadow. If they violate the restraining order, we'll handle it." So I wrote it down, each entry like another shield. But unlike before, I didn't tremble. Their desperation no longer frightened me, it only proved that I had been right to cut the cord. One Friday evening, Eleanor invited me to a small dinner with her daughter and grandchildren. Watching them interact, laughing, teasing, hugging, was like glimpsing another universe. A family built on respect and love, not transactions. As her granddaughter curled into her lap, Eleanor caught my eye and smiled knowingly. "You see," she whispered later as we washed dishes together, "this is what it looks like when love doesn't have a price tag." I nodded, tears threatening. "It's beautiful. And it hurts a little because I wanted that with David." She patted my shoulder. "Maybe someday. Or maybe never. Either way, you'll be fine. Because you finally love yourself." That night, lying in bed, I whispered into the darkness, "Robert, my love, I hope you see me now. I lost myself for so long, but I'm back. Stronger, wiser, free." For once the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was comforting. As the weeks turned into months, I began to plan things I never thought I'd do at 68. I booked a trip to Italy with the garden club for the spring. I enrolled in an evening course on creative writing, thinking maybe, just maybe, I could put my story on paper one day to help others. Each step forward was a quiet rebellion against the years I had given away. Yet I knew the storm hadn't completely passed. Melissa was not the kind of woman to accept defeat gracefully. David was too entangled in her web to return to me easily. I could almost feel them plotting in the shadows, waiting for their chance. But this time I wasn't afraid. I had my lawyer, my neighbors, my sister, my new friends, and most importantly, myself. The war wasn't over, but I finally had an army. And more than that, I had clarity. As I closed my journal one evening, I wrote the words that defined my transformation. "I may have lost a son, but I gained myself. And that is a trade I can live with." The night air was cool as I sat on the balcony of my new apartment overlooking downtown Denver. Lights sparkled across the city like scattered jewels, and the hum of life below rose and fell like a lullaby. I held a glass of wine in my hand and stared at the canvas propped against the wall, sunflowers bathed in golden light, a painting I had finished earlier that day. For years I'd spent every dime, every ounce of energy on David and Melissa. Tonight I realized with a shiver of triumph, my time, my money, and my love belonged to me. I thought back to the moment that had cracked me open, the words, "You missed the wedding. Only special people were invited." That phrase had followed me like a curse, waking me at night, burning in my chest whenever I replayed it. But now, sitting here in my own space, I could breathe it out and let it dissolve. I wasn't less special because of them. I had always been special, and I was finally treating myself that way. The weeks since the trial had felt like a rebirth. I took long walks through the park, greeting strangers with a smile. I joined a group of women who painted together on Saturdays, laughing and telling stories over coffee and acrylics. I even started volunteering with a nonprofit that helps seniors recognize and report elder financial abuse. Every time I shared my story, I saw the flicker of recognition in someone's eyes, the relief of knowing they weren't alone. My pain was becoming a shield for others, and that made the suffering worthwhile. Sometimes I heard whispers of David and Melissa's struggles. Word traveled fast in our community. They had fallen behind on their car payments, and the landlord had finally given them notice. Melissa had picked up her first real job in years, and David was scrambling to piece together side work. I didn't smile at their hardship, but I also didn't feel guilt. Karma has its own rhythm. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through overdue bills and empty fridges. They had counted on me being their cushion forever. When that cushion vanished, they fell hard. Diana called often from Dallas, and each time she said the same thing: "Helen, you sound lighter, happier, like the sister I used to know." And she was right. The woman who once begged for crumbs of affection had died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone fiercer, steadier, freer. One Sunday morning, Eleanor came by with her usual knock, and a pie balanced in her hands. We ate it warm in my kitchen, steam curling in the air while she teased me about the art show I had signed up for. Imagine, she laughed, after all this, you'll be the one people come to see, not for what you can give them, but for what you create. Her words struck deep. For decades I had been defined by sacrifice, the mother who gave, the widow who carried on, the woman who always paid. But now I was defined by something else: my choices, my independence, my art. That night, as I cleaned my brushes, I whispered to Robert's photo on the mantel. I finally learned the power of saying no. Tears slipped down my cheeks, but they weren't bitter. They were cleansing. I knew there might be more battles in the future. Melissa wasn't the type to vanish quietly, and David was too entangled to find his way back to me easily. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had Pierce, Eleanor, Diana, and the circle of strong women who reminded me every week that survival is sweeter when shared. Most importantly, I had myself. I could travel now. Italy was on the horizon with the garden club. I could donate to causes I believed in instead of funneling money into someone else's laziness. I could buy clothes that made me feel beautiful, or simply sit on my balcony with a glass of wine and paint the city lights. My life was finally fully mine. As I leaned back in my chair that evening, the stars winking above, I whispered aloud, "My name is Helen Crawford. I'm 68 years old, and I have finally learned that true love never has a price, and freedom is never too expensive." I turned my gaze back to the city, a smile tugging at my lips. "And now I want to ask you, what would you have done in my place? Would you have kept paying to be included, or walked away like I did?" Share your thoughts in the comments below. If my story touched you, please like this video, subscribe, and stay for more stories of justice, karma, and survival. Until next time.